sorry? I just turned it on. Maybe I was supposed to turn it on before I prayed, but I'm new at this. My apologies to whoever's on. So, Tim is out for the next 4 Wednesdays, I believe. Maybe it's 3, but I believe it's 4. 4. So, she confirms it's 4. So, congratulations. You get me for 4 weeks. We are not going to continue with Old Testament kings. We are going to, tonight we're going to look at the Apostle John. And, probably we'll move into his letters next week. But I always, one of the things that does interest me a lot about studying the Bible is looking at the transformation and the effect Jesus had on individual people. And John in particular is a great study. John is, he's got a name, and the name Jesus gave him wasn't by accident. And it was him and his brother, and they refer to as sons of thunder. And then if you look at his writings, and especially 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, it's not the same man. And it's amazing to watch and go through the transformation of John as portrayed in the Gospels, but also, as we see in his writings. So, just opening it up. What do you know about John? Andy, tell me one thing you know about John. He had a brother James. Clark. He was a fisherman. Marshall, tell me something about John. Sue, help me. Yeah, at least 4. Some attribute 5 to him. So, Sons of Thunder. Who was his dad? Zebedee. Mother? Mom? Most commentators will say it's Salome, S-A-L-O-M-E. There are some commentators who disagree, but the vast majority say it's Salome, if that's how you say that. Where was he from? Capernaum, Galilee area. Some say Bethsaida, some say Capernaum, but in the same general region. He was probably the younger brother, just because he's always mentioned second. And that's kind of in the first century writings, that's usually a pretty good indication he was the younger. The area that he came from was also an area where others of the apostles came from. So it's interesting to know what that area was viewed as. So he came from the north, Galilee. So I like looking at the secular writings for that period. So in the first century, there was a saying, if anyone wishes to be rich, let them go north. If anyone wants to be wise, let him go south. Well, so very interesting. So I didn't know what that meant, so I had to read further. The north was referring to Galilee. It was a travel route. It was a commerce center because of the Sea of Galilee and various other caravans that went there from other parts of what was the Middle East at the time. Jerusalem, on the other hand, was isolated. It was on top of the mountain. There was no trade routes that went through Jerusalem. You went to Jerusalem, you had a reason to be there. And as far as the Levites and the rabbinical class was concerned, you went to study the Lord. The reason you went to Jerusalem was to gain knowledge. The major source of commerce in Jerusalem was all tied to the temple and the surrounding areas around it. It was not, for lack of a better word, it was not a place you would go to get wealthy. It wasn't a commerce center, and it wasn't really a place where people went there. It was also, as you thought about Galilee, it was not well viewed by the leaders of the Jewish faith. The best thing to cover it, and there's several other references, but I always like the one in John 7, verses 50 through 52. And Nicodemus is saying that Jesus needs a fair hearing. And the reply from the Pharisees are you from Galilee as well? No prophet has ever come from Galilee. So the view was really well ingrained that the people like John were not what you would call well thought of amongst the ruling class of the Jews. In fact, there was a word, and I'm not even going to try and tell you the word, but it meant people of the land. And when you hear that, for us, that would just mean you're a farmer. In the first century, that meant you were uneducated and uncouth. You were vulgar. And it's funny, when I first traveled to China and was establishing a consulting business there, the woman who was for lack of a better word, our representative there, it kind of caught me off guard. And we were just walking around town, and she goes, those are village people. And I was like, she goes, they're classless. They come from the farms, and they just come here and beg. Now, she's like, they're not cultured. So I was kind of laughing, because I was like, okay, well, that fits well with what they said about the people from Galilee, of which, let's remember, John is part of that. The rabbis had 6 sayings for people of the land. 1, do not commit testimony to them. Don't pass on knowledge to them. 2, accept no testimony from them. So, if you happen to run into the people of the land, don't believe anything they say. 3, don't reveal secrets to them. Not trustworthy. 4, do not appoint them as guardians for orphans. Don't let your children around them. 5, do not appoint them stewards over charitable funds. They're thieves. 6, do not join in their company when traveling. They're thieves. They'll rob you. So it's funny when you think about kind of how the Jewish leaders, the rabbis of the first century, viewed where a vast majority of Jesus' apostles are going to come from. It's kind of ironic that most all of them are these people of the field. So the only one that we think came from Judea was Judas. Also ironic. What was Judas? He was a thief. So there's some irony in this whole process that Jesus sets up, and it's a backdrop of kind of who these people are and how they are kind of viewed as they become Jesus' apostles. And we're going to speak specifically of John himself. Josephus had a different, Josephus is a historical writer, and if you're going to look at secular writings about the Jews, Josephus is kind of the go-to person. But he viewed the Galileans as being very different. He didn't have the rabbinical view of the Galileans. He viewed them as industrious and independent. He viewed them as courageous. And he actually wrote, Galileans have endured war since infancy, and they are not destitute of men of courage. And the good thing he noted about the Galileans is they were in a fertile part of Israel. They could grow trees, they could grow crops, and he said they were very good business people and excelled at trade. So it's kind of, so we have an understanding here that's going to reign through Jesus' ministry. The people that he surrounds himself with are well thought of by Josephus and obviously well thought of by Jesus. They are despised by the people who are the ruling class of the Jews. The Pharisees despise them. They think they are less than honorable people who really don't deserve the secrets that we have to share. So that's kind of the backdrop. It's also not surprising that when you look at the ministry, it was much more effective in the north than it was in Jerusalem. They have a large following when Jesus is in Galilee, in Capernaum and Bethsaida. It gets very, very, very confrontational when he moves into Judea, especially around Jerusalem. So that's kind of, for lack of a better word, the backdrop to kind of where John grows up. He is, like I said, his father is Zebedee. Most people say his mother is Salome. Once again, we do know that because of what's written in Matthew, that whoever James and John's mother was, she was at the cross. When Jesus died and was on the cross, I think it's Matthew that tells us explicitly, and at the cross was the mother of James and John. So it's not just James and John who are following Jesus. Their mother is clearly a follower of Jesus as well. When John, kind of just, once again, this is really relying on kind of secular backgrounds. The Galilean area was big enough to have a synagogue, so most likely John went to study by the age of 6. And for years 6 through 10, they studied nothing but the scriptures. That's what they were taught from. So every Jewish child went through in a city that had a synagogue. From ages 6 to 10, they were taught the scriptures. From 11 to 15, they were given a broader set of trainings that took in some secular history. But chances are, by the time they reached 15, they were done. Their education was completed. They did not go on to study with the rabbis. They did not go to study with the scholars. Now, we know that there were exceptions, and once again, amongst some of the apostles, but most notably Paul. Paul was obviously taught by, I think it's Gamaliel. I always get these names wrong, but he was taught by a rabbi, by a learned scholar, and was kind of the exception to the rule here. Peter, James, and John most likely had just this basic education. And as was noted, they became fishermen. Most commentators, and this is the one I didn't know, and you can go study you can draw your own conclusion. Okay, in John chapter 1, verses 35 and 36, there's this interesting communication. The next day, John was there again with 2 of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." When the 2 disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, "What do you want?" They said, "Rabbi, where are you staying? Come and you will see." So they went and saw where he was staying and spent the day with him. It was about the 10th hour. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the 2 who heard what John had to say, and he followed Jesus. So we have that. So, and once again, I will let you determine whether or not you believe the commentators are correct or not. Most of the commentators will tell you that second disciple was John. Now, once again, you have to go through their own reasoning, and after reading all their reasoning, I agree. But once again, it's not definitive. But if you accept their understanding that is John, so it's the first indication of a set of behaviors, especially with Andrew, who is definitive, that some people became acquainted with Jesus initially through John the Baptist. And it's interesting, their reaction. They're following John the Baptist, and John the Baptist says, "There's the Son of God," the Lamb of God in this translation. And without question, their reaction is, "Let me go follow him for a day." Marshall? Yes. That was John the Baptist. That's John the Baptist. The interesting thing about the Gospel of John is he never refers to John the Baptist as John the Baptist. He just refers to him as John. And the reason being because the writer never refers to himself. He never refers to himself in this Gospel, ever. Right. And there's 2 or 3 other ways that he refers to himself, but that was the prominent one. But John, when you read the Gospel of John, you see John, it's John the Baptist. But it's, especially if we know one was Andrew, and the commentaries will go through, and you can, once again, this is not definitive, but I found it convincing, so I'm gonna kind of just at least acknowledge that it's a possibility. So here's John the Baptist, and 2 of the disciples are following him around and spending time with him, and they are immediately attracted to this man Jesus. And their first reaction is, "Where are you staying?" Then they spend the day with him. And just think about that and this is how I always kind of like to, when I look at these personalities. So, we all hang out with certain people. And once again, it's always a stretch to sometimes make these commentaries to what they are today. Let's say you have a favorite preacher. You know, once again, somebody that you follow, somebody that you think is important. And he goes, Marshall's a better preacher than I am. What's your reaction going to be? You're going to say, hey, Marshall, where are you going to spend the next day? What can I learn from you over the next day? Notice their reaction. Not even a question. And the most interesting thing is John the Baptist clearly expects them to follow. But it takes a certain type of person to just be that accepting of the Messiah. Now, once again, and I always bring this up, but what were Andrew's and John's expectation for the Messiah? Right. He's going to conquer, in this case, the Romans. We're going to set up an earthly kingdom. That's what they're looking for. And trust me, they don't get it until the very end. That's what they're looking for. And John, we can see as we go through this, his personality is such that a conqueror would be very intriguing to him. He wants a conqueror. That fits his personality extremely well. Excuse me. So, as you think of these two men and the understanding of what is going to be asked of them, when the first century writers are talking about discipleship, there were really two characteristics they were looking for. And once again, we think of discipleship as a Jesus-centric phenomenon. It was not. The concept of people following rabbis was a well-understood practice in the first century. There were people who were designated as disciples of a certain rabbi. And the idea behind that was you had to leave everything behind to become a follower of that rabbi. And you were expected to imitate that rabbi. That was the goal. Why you were leaving everything else that you had was to become an imitator of that rabbi. And they tell a funny story, and I thought it was funny, so I'm going to run with it. But it was written by one of the historical commentators. He was a kind of a famous first century rabbi. His name was Hillel, Hillel. And he had been a follower of a different rabbi. But he went so far with his imitation that when he went out in public, he continually mispronounced a word. And the people were finally like, you know you're not saying that right. And he goes, I'm well aware I'm not saying that right, but that's the way my rabbi said it. So I will continue that tradition. So the concept of imitation was ingrained in this concept of discipleship. So when Andrew and Andrew and John are first introduced to Christ, they've obviously understood through their relationship with John the Baptist what discipleship was about, because he refers to them as what? Two of his disciples. So they know what this concept is, and they completely understand it. Now, the interesting thing is they spend time with Jesus, but then next thing we hear about, they're back working. They're back out on a boat. Now, we know that Zebedee is their father, and he has a boat. We know that they're partners with Peter and Andrew, and they have a boat. So we know that they're not hired help. We know from the writings that Zebedee not only had at least two sons, but he also had hired hands that worked for him on his boat. Now, maybe you all knew this, I didn't. The boat that they're referring to is not when we see the films, like you see The Chosen, or you see something that represents the fishermen, the apostles. It's kind of a small boat. It's bigger than a canoe, but not really that much bigger. It's pulled up on shore, and, you can manhandle it around. Chances are this boat was 26 feet long, minimum, and at least 8 feet wide, with a depth of somewhere around 4 feet. and it most likely had a sail in the middle. It could hold anywhere from 13 to 15 people. So that was kind of shattered my understanding of what these guys were doing. This is a little bit more of an industrial size operation than it is just kind of two men out in a boat. And we know from the writings about Zebedee, there are at least 5 people operating his boat and when Jesus comes and calls James and John. Because we know it's Zebedee, James and John, and it said, and the plural is used for the hired help. So it's at least 5. And we know that they take fishing boats to cross the Galilee with Jesus when he falls asleep. And so that boat probably was holding at least 13 people, if not more. So these boats are much bigger than at least I pictured in my head. And go ahead.
Just a few years ago, the archaeologists dug up a boat out in the mud, the size you're describing, and look at the drawing of it and say, yeah, I can see 13 people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what Clark's referring to, they found a first century fishing vessel, and it was so decomposed that they had to put it in styrofoam or some kind of plaster to, for lack of a better word, to safeguard it. But that was as recently as 1986 is when they started the excavation of this particular boat that Clark is referring to. It took them 11 years to fully excavate it because that's how careful they had to be, how tenuous the situation of that boat was. But as Clark said, that particular boat was 26 feet and 7.5 feet wide and had a depth of just short of 4 feet. So it was very much in keeping with what historical records say the size of these fishing boats actually were. So, as Jesus is getting ready to start his ministry, it's kind of interesting. We can kind of draw our own conclusions, but if you were going to describe the people that Jesus is going to select as his apostles, what do you notice about them? What are some of the attributes you would assign to the apostles? The ones that we know about.
Well, I think they're devout men.
Right.
Journeying down to be taught by John the Baptist and coming back and telling others about him, telling others John the Baptist said this about Jesus and so on. They're very religious men who are expecting the Messiah. And Jesus didn't just randomly say, let's grab some fishermen. They were chosen to be suitable. But at the same time, fishermen were not that world's most highly educated people.
Right. Yep.
So they were chosen more for devotion than for any kind of social standing or any such thing.
And kind of saying that as well is Jesus went out of his way to not pick men of social standing. So you go through all the apostles and you tell me who the upstanding citizen is, who's going to be accepted by the Jerusalem Pharisees.
He didn't try to get any Galilean rabbi.
Yeah, he didn't take a Galilean rabbi. He didn't take any really what you would call wealthy man, even though James and John probably were well-to-do. He didn't take any of the leaders in Jerusalem. Those weren't the people that Jesus said, I'm going to build my discipleship around. And he seems to take men who are serious, who have, you can say their jobs are respectable or not. Matthew clearly was not viewed as respectable by the other Jews, but he took men who clearly went about a task that was given to them. They weren't people who were sitting around waiting. And you notice with James and if it is John and Andrew, even after they meet the Messiah, they turn around and go to work. They don't wait to be a disciple of Jesus. They go back to work. And so we know that, and we're going to turn to Luke chapter 5. Marshall, you ready to read? Okay. So in Luke chapter 5, it's there, and there's once again there. One of the things is, I think Clark, you're going to be studying the Gospels with everyone, right?
Yeah.
Starting Sunday.
Kind of studying the character of Jesus through the gospel.
Okay. But if you look at the Gospels, there are very different and different versions of the first calling of the disciples. So this one in particular, I thought was more clear about John. You ready? Verses 1 through 11, please.
One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge two boats left there by the fishermen, who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. And he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him.
Okay. So, notice the process that Jesus is going through here. And these four are obviously four of the initial apostles that are called. Andrew has already met Jesus. We know that for a fact. Chances are John has already met him too, if you accept that he was the second disciple. Andrew went immediately to Peter and told Peter about Jesus after he met him. And you would assume if the second disciple is John, that he went home and told James. So it's not like this man is a stranger to the four men. They know who he is. And so Jesus got a following. And the reason he's going to meet these guys is because he's teaching. Now, they're busy about their job. Now, they had just wasted an entire night fishing. Now, once again, interesting to understand if you want to look at the secular history about why they fished at night. Because the sea that Marshall talked about is the Sea of Galilee. He refers to it as the lake, and I can't ever say that word, so I'm not going to try. But it's the Sea of Galilee, which is what we normally refer to it as. So Jesus is teaching, and he borrows Simon's boat, and he pushes off so he can have a better platform to preach from. And so he gets done preaching, and you kind of think there's a break in the action here. And so he says, "Simon, let's go to the deep water." Simon, I love Simon. Simon's like me. Dude, I was out there for 12 hours. There ain't no fish. He says, "But if you say so, I'm going to kind of run with Andrew here. He trusts you. All right, I'm going to trust you." And so we read where, they're overwhelmed with fish. But the interesting thing is, Jesus gets them to shore and says, "Let's go." And we know the four followed. But I think one of the most interesting things is, Zebedee doesn't say, "Whoa, we have a business to run. Where are you going?" Zebedee clearly understands what's going on here. And off they go. Now, one of the things that I always find interesting is this clearly made an impression on John, because he later writes to us another account. So if you turn over to John chapter 21, and he's the only one that covers this count. Clark, can you read John chapter 21, verses 1 through 9.
After this, Jesus revealed himself again to his disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. He revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael from Cana of Galilee, Zebedee's sons, and two others of his disciples were together. I'm going fishing, Simon Peter said to them. We're coming with you, they told him. They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. When daybreak came, Jesus stood on the shore. However, the disciples did not know Jesus. Then Jesus called them, you don't have any fish, do you? No, they answered. Cast the net on the right side of the boat, he told them, and you'll find some. So they did, and they were unable to haul it in because of the large number of fish. Therefore the disciple, the one Jesus loved, said to Peter, it is the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he tied his outer garment around him, for he was stripped, and plunged into the sea. But since they were not far from land, about 100 yards away, the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish lying on it and bread.
So it's interesting that this is a story that John tells. The other Gospels don't tell it. And it is interesting how much it parallels his calling. His, Andrew, Peter, and James calling. Same thing. Christ has died. So what do? They go back to work. Andrew and John met Jesus. What do? They went back to work. So they're out there, and the story says that Peter says, let's go fishing. And they're told to follow instructions. And it later says that they caught 153 fish. I'm not sure why 153 is so specific, but John thought it was important to tell you it was 153. But who recognizes who it is? John. Yeah, they were a ways out. It says that when they went in, Peter was 100 yards away. Okay? So how much can you see from 100 yards? You ever tried? Stand on a football field and see what you see. Now, not only are you 100 yards away, you're in a boat. And the boat's bobbing. Exactly. He doesn't have a telescope. Why does John know it's Jesus? And he's been on this journey before. He's been told, go do something with your boat and your net. It was his initial calling. And John, I'm convinced, the reason he tells this story is things have come full circle. This is completed. I was brought to Jesus because he told me to go fish. I am now seeing the resurrected Jesus because he told me to go fish. So in John's mind, it's completed. He understands exactly who it is. And the funny thing is, John's not the one that jumps in the water and goes swimming towards the shore. That's Peter. And once again, clearly he didn't have to walk on water this time, so he was okay. But so, we see in John kind of an interesting, and he has several things in the Gospel of John that are included because they're very, very relevant to him. They're not in the other Gospels, but they're in John because they're meaningful to him. They were things that he remembered about his interaction with Jesus that were purposeful, that were impactful. And I think in John you see this grand awakening he starts to understand as he goes along what's expected of him. So, and then the reason we know that Zebedee was with them is when you read the accounts of the calling. If you want to read Mark chapter 1, 16 through 20, that's where we realize that Zebedee was there and he had the hired help. But once again, we don't, like I said, we can read each of those. Yeah, the writings. Yeah.
I mean, it helps you understand that it has to be from God. It can't be.
Mm-hmm. No, that's fine. So the 12 are called, and John is clearly one of the 12. And he's called with his brother, and like I said, he's the younger of the two brothers. Most secular writers will tell you he's the youngest of the apostles. Now, they go through a long reasoning for why he's the youngest. I found it interesting. Well, I'm not convinced that's true, but yeah. He does live longer than the rest of them, but yeah, that's not necessarily because of old age. So, but the reasoning is that John is probably the youngest. But it's interesting, as the 12 apostles are forming around Jesus, you have the 12, which is the discipleship group that are going to be the people responsible for carrying on Jesus' ministry upon his death. But there's also an inner circle of the 12. It's like everything else in life. There's the chosen, but then there's the trusted. Not that the others aren't trusted, but there's an inner circle to the 12. And John's a part of that. It's James, John, and Peter. They have a unique perspective on Jesus. They are the ones that have, for lack of a better term, intimate knowledge of Jesus. They're there on certain events, and the others aren't. And I probably have not captured them all. I did a search as best I could, but here are at least 4 times when it's just the 3 of them with Jesus. The raising of Jairus' daughter, Mark chapter 5. The transfiguration, Matthew 17. The Garden of Gethsemane, Matthew 26. And the Mount of Olives in Mark 13. Now, there may be other cases, but I know those 4. These 3 men are with Jesus, and the others are not. And we don't have a full account of what goes on there, but everybody has that inner circle. Okay? You have your friends, your family, your acquaintances, but then you have the people that you share things with, the people you trust, the people you can share with and know they'll keep it confidential. That's who these 3 men are. Jesus has identified them as his, for lack of a better word, his inner circle.
It's pretty stark at the transfiguration that these 3 are having all this amazing revelation. The rest of them are down the mountain, failing to heal the man's son, arguing.
Right. Yeah, so this is a good stopping point. We'll pick up there and we'll start talking a little bit about kind of the learning curve that the apostles go through, and then some of the unique, for lack of a better word, observations of John through the gospel, and then as time permits, we'll get into his letters. Thank you.